Hey guys, in this video let's review Metaphor ReFantazio, with the usual topics, the story, gameplay, graphics, a bit of the collector's edition, and music. Beware that this video contains spoilers, but I will leave the most important things aside. So this is a story that I want to separate in two parts, about its main plot and its philosophy. I won't dive too much into them, otherwise I could be here several hours explaining every single detail, and that's not the purpose. But let's begin with the main plot, which is all about the assassination of the king by Louis, as the king had bad fantasies or ideals about uniting the multiple tribes that live in this setting. However, all we can see is that the king is pretty much kicking the bucket, and a man with strong ideals to rebuild that nation. And without hesitating, Louis stabs the king, so he can take the throne to bring a new order. On the other side of the coin, we follow a young boy with what seems to be an impossible task, to lift the curse that was cast on the prince many years ago. Moments later we get to see that the hometown of the prince was burned down. A bit of the lore aside, that is the reason why he's hidden from the public eye, as he would be targeted by other antagonists that want to take the throne for their own machinations. So the main character has to infiltrate into this nation, to find either the cure or kill the caster. Returning to the main idea, what Luis and the others didn't take into consideration is that the king had a spell under his sleeve, where he pretty much told the people that whomever wants to take the throne is free to do it, as soon as this person is accepted by the majority. With this in mind, the elder boy enlists himself to have the chance to get close to Luis, so he can fulfill his task. This could be the whole summary of the main story, so to speak, but what I found quite interesting is that here there is a quite complex lore, as there are multiple antagonists that effectively pull the strings at different moments in time, and as we advance, of course we will get to know about those details. However, it is fair to mention that this game plays quite well with different emotions, effectively engaging with the player, or at least I found several of those moments quite interesting. Perhaps some felt a bit trivial, like the whole thing to prove who was worthy of the throne, but the game always took an unpredictable direction, or at least it took me for a fool a couple of times. Now beware that along the journey you will read a freaking lot, but this game has an amazing narrative. This is the moment where we can switch to the sub-narratives about Metaphor. Every time you bring another follower to the crew, there is a small chat about the book that the main character carries around. One utopic world, where sovereigns are chosen without bloodshed. There is no discrimination regardless of appearances, lineage or birth. There are no forced ideologies. From a narrative point of view, it is philosophy in its full expression, and something I consider like a white glove slap, because it is needless to say that they are placing quite high the human society. Human society that we know has a lot of dysfunctions, and along the journey we can see those issues, probably the biggest one regarding discrimination. Now, it is an interesting way to hide a critique to modern society, considering that there are a lot of dumb conflicts out there, and that part of the subtext is shown with humans. Later we get to know how they could be born, but in game setting, a human is a beast with bloodlust, a being that succumbs to anxiety, fear, and melancholy. Quite ironic, huh? But also that human beings effectively effed up in a conflict, and some years later here we are, in a dystopian world reigned by puppeteers, perhaps with good intentions, but lack of backbone to effectively bring the true potentials of the society, which slowly succumbs into also forced ideologies. Now, it is not surprised that one of the stumbling blocks in this story is shown as the Sanctist Church, and this is not the first time Atlus has brought these kind of ideas. If you ever finish a Strange Journey and got the low ending, at some point in Metaphor you will see something quite similar, which of course could be depicted as salvation. However, I will question how true that is. And on the other hand, you get chaos, or the law of the strongest one. Of course, this is just the tip of the iceberg, because there is a lot of cloth to cut here, and how it is also true that philosophy alone cannot save a nation, reason why modern philosophy was born. But one of the points that I definitely loved is that the characters challenge those ideas, like, yeah, it sounds cool, a place with no discrimination, but we are several centuries away from that. And it is shown with multiple tribes that prefer to live as recluses, rather than opening their doors to others. Or even more interesting, those who have to change appearances to be taken seriously. So yep, this game pretty much describes our society in the past years quite well. There are some other interesting messages along the journey. but that is diving way too deep into the classic esoteric ideas Atlus handles in these games. So if you want to understand much more what's going on the subtext and the peculiar journey of our main character, you will have to read and understand some bits of the Kabbalah, the Fourth Way, and stuff like that. In its own, it is worth mentioning that due to the nature of the game, there are some things taken out of the context, but I don't think it diminishes the experience. So once we combine all of these parts, we get Metaphor ReFantazio. And yep, what a way to handle a story that is filled to the brim of interesting ideas, philosophy, and symbolism, accompanied with an amazing cast of characters and thought-provoking moments. I could question how some events were handled, but in general, it was of my liking. For me, it is a 10 in this section. Gameplay-wise, as far as I know, this is a mix between fantasy setting, Persona, and of course, Mega 10. Through the journey we are going to visit different locations a couple of times, but in general the journey is a straight line, so there are several missable things, but I will say don't sweat it, you can get the platinum until your second run, and it is going to test your team quite well. So my best recommendation is try to enjoy the journey the best you can. With that said, every day you can do but a couple of activities, so it is important to balance social and exploration, because by adding followers into the mix, you get the archetypes or classes of the game. However, if you want to effectively do most of the quests, they can be accessible in your second day per region. So once you reach a new area, go there, talk to some people. There are some missable things there too, which I didn't like, but it is what it is, I guess. Also, you can find interesting surprises and free items. And while doing that, trigger all the quests before adventuring, as sometimes dungeons are done the same way as trivial tasks. Once you do that, plan accordingly, because ideally you want to finish them in one try. On their own, the dungeons are on the simple side, aside from story ones, which can be a bit challenging if you recklessly charge in. Oftentimes the biggest deal is running out of MP, so having your main character as a mage is a decent idea. That way you can get MP while stunning or defeating enemies. Some crystals along the journey can be found, and they can be used to farm some levels and get your MP back. And try to use your Magra pills wisely, and stuff like that, because they are quite limited until really late in the game. So keep that in mind. Aside from that, I will say that this is the easiest Mega 10 entry I have played, because you can retry fights on the spot, and triggering battles at first gives you a lot of advantages. Sure, I won't deny that my team was wiped out sometimes. That is something bound to happen while you get the idea of how to beat some enemies. Accidents while exploring the areas, finding a mob able to deal a lot of damage, some late bosses if you never took the time to farm some levels, and that's it. Aside from that, I can say that the last true boss is not as complicated as others in Mega 10, but it is important to balance your team with different skills, as many enemies in this game lack weaknesses, so you need to actively pursue weak points by using some magics or attacks that leave a weak point. That is what I found the most interesting, because I thought it was going to be similar to your average SMT, but nope. And also mastering an archetype gives you extra HP, MP, luck, etc. So it is a good idea to master some in between. Those free extra MP are really useful in long battles. It is fair to mention that these characters have kind of detailed tasks. You can try to train them for another thing, but they will be outmatched by other characters. Perhaps my main complaint here is that at first there is no real magic user, because Stroll is pure melee damage and Hulkenberg is a tank, and the next character in the list is not a magic user. While I will say that I created MC according to my morale and values, in the long run I noticed that it was going to be a bit questionable to have physical users. However, in the late game I ended up using magic characters, so do whatever you want. The game is easy enough to mess up in normal difficulty. I'm sure higher difficulties will punish that mambo jumbo I threw in between, so always try to buff and debuff, ways to clear buffs on the enemies and leave the debuffs in your party members. With that, most of the fights are quite straightforward. On that front, I never planned a peculiar way to build my characters. It was more about training as much archetypes as possible, and once I capped them, change for another archetype, and so on. That way I have fresh skills in every character, which helps a lot, because sometimes you need two characters doing the same task or stuff like that. Now, a thing to be aware are the climate effects while advancing in the story. The first areas you find with these effects are easy to maneuver, as they will have this blight thing once every 2 days, so you can plan how you are going to tackle the adventure. However, later in the journey, there is a place that never changes, unless you decide to talk with the brother of the best girl, but keep that as a last resort. It is going to be useful way later. I could say that those are the basics of the game. However, the thing that left a bad taste is that I thought the humans would be these kind of exotic fights every single time, like perhaps having a different target, then trying to pull a random idea in between and stuff like that. I was amazed by that boss. Unfortunately, the others you find along the journey lack similar ideas, and in all honesty, I was expecting something similar. Sometimes they have a gimmick or two, but not as random and interesting as the one I showed previously. Other thing that I would have liked is having more areas to explore. I felt that the subjugation quests were few, compared with the amount of time you can spend talking with the other characters or doing activities within towns. Perhaps that is my perception because I was trying to complete every single quest, trigger most events and so on, compared to the time I spent in dungeons or preparing to hunt some enemies. For me, its gameplay is a 9.5. The only reason why I reduced some points in this category is because I was expecting something more dynamic out of some bosses, which unfortunately didn't happen aside from 3-4 encounters. Other than that, Metaphor carries the same solid ideas from all entries, and while at first they can be a bit punishing, later they are a lot of fun. Now let's jump into the graphics of the game. I am not a person who's picky on this department, but it is fair to mention that this is the lowest point in the game. In any case, in this section I like to check creativity, performance, issues, and pretty much whatever that comes as something visual. In this entry I had no issues with the game getting close or something like that, which is something I definitely appreciate. However, there are some performance details while playing it, and you don't need to pay that much attention to notice them. Sometimes textures or stuff like that are not as polished as you might imagine. So there are moments where you can see something like the polygons in some scenes, and sometimes in cutscenes you can see how certain movements look slightly laggy. Then again, I don't care about these issues, but they exist. However, if there is something that the game needed are fresh ideas about enemies. Unfortunately, throughout the game you will see the same enemies a lot of times, over and over again, to the point where it doesn't surprise at all. And considering that this is a game that is praised by some fashion ideas, to me it is important to keep fresh some of these executions. In all honesty, I wouldn't mind if they reuse some of the SMT enemies and stuff like that, as soon as the story is fresh enough with enemies. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. But on the other hand, there are enemies that are interesting as heck, or at the very least I found them appealing. Now, I am not into fashion, more like your average dude that wears stuff of the same color and color a day. But if you wanna dive into something similar and considering that this is accurately, there is an anime and manga named Smile Down the Wrong Way, where you will see similar ideas as what you see in this game. What's worth saying is that at the end of every chapter in the manga, there is a little explanation of how some designs are created, the industry and stuff like that. It is a light story, but I just wanna throw it here for those who like the direction that was taken in this video game. With all of this, for me, its graphics are a 9. The fact is that I liked how the game looks, how the animations were handled in general, as well as the attacks and stuff like that. Some of them being a bit cartoonish while others look quite imposing. And while I don't understand the fashion on the way it was thrown into this entry, I gotta say that it was interesting to see different executions throughout the journey. Let's follow with a brief talk about the collector edition, and right away I will say that this is a 6 out of 10, because for the asking price, it is not that great, or at least putting it into comparison with others that are much cheaper. The thing is that it wasn't properly reinforced on the inside, and well, sending stuff from one country to another is a wild bet sometimes, but in this case it's more about the quality of the bots. So yeah, the inside was a bit of a mess. Now diving into its content, it has 2 discs with the whole soundtrack of the game, being around 2 hours and 40 minutes. The digital bonuses offer 2.5 hours, as well as a small story about some Atlus themes. Personally, I would have liked to see as many entries as possible, but most of them were the cherished ones. I haven't given myself the time to read it all, but it has some interesting things here and there. Returning to the physical things, it has a map of the game, the steelbook, some feed, an art book and stickers. I'll come back to the DLC in a moment. While I like the art book, once again, it was quite pricey for what it is. Some of you know my opinion on soft covers. I am not a fan of them. As for the contents, I felt like it doesn't have that many things, considering how big this game is. So yeah, there's plenty of stuff to improve here. Now, the part that stick with me the most, aside from the soundtrack, were the attires that come with the DLC. I would have liked to have the Demonica like in SMT4, but I would take the samurai garb any day of the week. And what is cool is that depending on what you use, every time you enter into combat with a stunned enemy, a different combat theme plays. In this case, most of the time I listen to Battle/A2, which is something I appreciate a lot. However, at best I can say that this collector's edition is decent. Worth mentioning that this is not a part of the game, so consider this section as a side thing. And to finish the review, it's music. I don't know if it is just me, but every time I hear the Chief Priest, like in Warriors in Arms, somehow I can hear God Shattering a Star from Fire Emblem Three Houses. I mean, once I place them side by side, they are quite different, but I get a similar vibe. In any case, this is a game that also reminds me a lot to A Strange Journey, for the kind of martial and tribal rhythm that is used in tracks like Untrodden Caves, Soaring Towers. There are similar beats that remind me a lot to Scorching Nation, from that Shin Megami Tensei. And for the kind of combination of vocals, air instruments and flow of the game, I could say that they took a lot of inspiration from A Strange Journey. Of course, there is more avocado in this entry, so the arrangements are much more refined in comparison to a DS game. But in general, I like the way its OST lands in the game, with tracks like Traversing the Waves. It is probably my favorite track in Metaphor. It has a nice pace which combines the strength from both male and female vocals quite well, and there are multiple compositions that are of my liking, like The Verge of Life and Death, Human by Name, Window to a New World, and You Face Louis. In general, the combination of strings, air, and rhythm goes quite well. For me, its soundtrack is a 10. The whole game has many beautiful compositions. Metaphor ReFantazio final score is a 9.6. I definitely recommend it, as it has a beautiful story beginning to end, a rich narrative with interesting twists left and right, that reward the attentive eye. Of course, the whole journey is also filled with extraordinary messages and solid ideas in its gameplay, where you create peculiar combinations, and all this package accompanied with a magnificent OST. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.